Pro-con is in the pro and con business, and what is really strange is that an organization that is decidedly pro has invited the con side here to explain their points of view. I was thinking, what is that like? That would be like going to a gun control conference and inviting the NRA, or that would be like going to a Planned Parenthood conference and inviting Operation Rescue. It sounds counterintuitive, right? But what we've learned at procon.org is that it's very intuitive. This makes perfect sense, and part of the reason why is because one of the best ways to learn, one of the best ways to convince yourself and your opponents that you're right is to know how they think, to know their arguments, to get inside their head, to understand what drives their decision-making process. And that's why it's so important, and I really applaud MGIC for inviting David Evans and inviting Procon, inviting people with contrary points of view to come up here, present their best arguments. It's in your best interest to understand what those are, and I'm just really amazed that they chose to do that, so thank you again to them. You know, I want to talk a little bit about Procon, and then I want to introduce this background to this discussion, then I want to introduce the debaters, and then we're going to go. Okay, so this will take me in maybe another 6 or 7 minutes or so. So let me do this. First, I want to talk a little bit about Procon, and thank you, David, for giving this background to us. We've been around since 2004. We're a 501c3 nonprofit public charity. We've had over 100 million readers come to our website since we started, and that's about 23 million last year alone. Medical marijuana is one topic that we cover. If you type it into Google, it's probably going to be the first or second site that you see. And what's really cool about it is that it shows both sides. So because it shows both sides, because the arguments are sourced and everything is transparent, and we're a nonprofit, we don't collect ads on the site, really it's neutral, truly. We're used a lot by schools. So about half our audience are kids in schools. Teachers feel comfortable sending their kids to Procon instead of to Wikipedia. They know they're going to get both sides. We've done that for gun control. We've done it for same-sex marriage. We've done it for insider trading by members of Congress. We've done it for is golf a sport. We've done it for US drone strikes overseas, and we've done it to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Who is our audience? Well, the Arab-Israeli conflict website has been used by 5th graders whose teacher is trying to teach them what this issue is all about. It's also been used by the government of the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli Knesset. It's really a site that's tiered towards all levels. Same with medical marijuana. That site has been referenced by groups you know, NORML, Americans for Safe Access. It's used by Marijuana Policy Project. We work with all these groups very closely. It's also been used by the Drug Enforcement Administration. It's also been referenced by the White House. It's also been referenced by the Office of National Drug Control Policy. It's been referenced in the Journal of American Medical Association, New England Journal of Medicine, on and on. It's really a neutral source, and for that, I just encourage you to visit the site and check it out for yourselves and see for yourselves what it has to offer. Currently, we are neck deep in the 2016 presidential election. We've been chasing after all the candidates to get their views on the issues, including medical marijuana, including recreational marijuana. If they don't tell us the answer, that's okay. We've got a full-time staff of researchers with PhDs and master's degrees. They're going to find it. They're going to find what that person ever said on the subject, and then we'll put it on the site so you can see what they said. And use that as the basis to inform yourself on which candidates you support or not. So that's a little bit about Procon. I'm very pleased to say that today we're here joined by 2 other members of the organization. We're here with our CEO, Mr. Jay Rakow, and our Director of Development, Jeannie Ring. Thank you, folks. They're very friendly, very nice. When you see them walking around, please introduce yourselves and tell them a little bit about your backgrounds. Because we look at all sides, we're very interested in your points of view. We want to make sure that in this discussion of medical marijuana, all points of view are heard. And hopefully, as we start to build a site about recreational marijuana, we want to also include your voices. So please come and introduce yourselves to us and tell us what it is that you're working on. Where do you get your information? What issues are important to you? So that's Procon. Really, the basis of what we're doing is critical thinking. That's what it's all about. Now, let's talk a little bit, just so I understand who's in the room here today. I'm curious, how many people are here or from California but are not from the Bay Area? Just by a show of hands, you're Californian but not Bay Area. Okay, interesting. How about people who are not from California at all? Wow, a lot of you, that's tremendous. How about Bay Area folks? Where are you? Bay Area, oh wow, all right. All right, well thank you Bay Area folks. You know, Bay Area folks, you remember this, 1996, This was ground zero for a major change in public policy on the issue of marijuana. This is the city of Dennis Peron. This was the city of Americans for Medical Rights. This is the city that really helped to push Proposition 215 and launch this wave throughout the country that has now changed the country in a dramatic way. We used to not have medical marijuana laws until folks in the San Francisco Bay Area decided we're going to put it on the ballot, and by gosh, they did. Then here comes Oregon, here comes Washington, here comes state after state after state. We're up to 23 states, as you well know, and the District of Columbia that have legalized marijuana for medical purposes. That's about half the country, right? Now, last year, we had 4 states, last year, a little of the year before, 4 states that have legalized marijuana for any purposes, right? And those states, we're going to see how that pans out. Is Colorado a success story or a tragedy? Is Oregon doing it right, or is Washington doing it right? Is nobody doing it right? These are the tough issues as more states, possibly 8 more states this year, are going to be considering whether or not to legalize marijuana for recreational purposes. So we got to look at the record. We got to look at those states. We got to look at the medical states. We got to look at the history. We got to look at science. We got to look at public policy. We got to think about things like, what about the kids? What about health? What about the old and infirm? What about the economy? What about crime? What about so many things? It's a complicated issue, and I am certainly not smart enough to figure that stuff out. Thankfully, we have the benefit of some really tremendous experts here today who are going to help us think through these issues and understand what are the pros and the cons in this debate about marijuana legalization. And before I introduce them, I just want to mention one other thing, that public opinion on the issue of marijuana legalization has really shifted over about a 30-year period. You look at the Gallup polls, and it used to be dramatic. The people who were opposed to marijuana legalization was up in the 60s, 70s, 80s percentile compared to those who favored it. Right now, it's roughly 50-50, roughly. So you think, oh, it's trending that way. However, last year, 2015, 19 states introduced legislation to pass medical marijuana. You know how many of those 19 passed? 0. 19 states failed legislation to pass medical marijuana only. And you think about this, 2 of them famously so, right? The ballot measure in Ohio, we're all familiar with that. That was a big bust. What about in Florida? They couldn't get to 60%, didn't pass there. Which way is the trend line going? I don't know. We thankfully have some experts who can give their 2 cents on that issue. So let's get to it, folks. Let me introduce our debaters for today. Very honored, so excited to bring these folks to the stage. These are big names in the debate. First, I want to introduce the primary proponent of legalization. He's a person who's probably the most recognized name on the pro side on the legalization debate, Mr. Ethan Nadelmann. Now, Ethan is someone that is the founder and director of an organization called the Drug Policy Alliance. Smart guy. He got his bachelor's degree, his JD, PhD from Harvard University, right? I think you have a master's degree from London School of Economics. Very impressive. Ethan, you've written 2 books on the subject. You've written countless articles on policy journals, popular magazines, other types of publications. You've appeared on numerous debates. You debated, I saw, Bill O'Reilly. You're on Colbert's program. You're on CNN multiple times, and a few of those instances with Mr. David Evans. You've accomplished a lot of things. One of my favorite things is that your TED Talk was viewed, I think it's the 3rd most viewed TED Talk ever. You had 1.3 million viewers. That's really impressive. So David, I'm going to invite you onto stage, and as you come up, I just have a quick question for you. And that is, a few weeks ago, when you vacationed big. You climbed K2, the tallest mountain in Africa, right at the tip of Tanzania. And at the time, you said that was the highest you've ever been. Jokes about it.
It sure was, Cammy, over 19,000 feet. And I guess you wanted the one tidbit that I remember most clearly was how much weed there was walking up that hill.
All right, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, Ethan Nadelmann.
Hey, thank you.
Okay. Now, another very distinguished speaker here today, folks. This is really tremendous, and I'm so honored that we are able to introduce him here today. gentleman by the name of Mr. David Evans. Now, David Evans is Executive Director of the Drug-Free Schools Coalition. He's been a special advisor to the Drug-Free America Foundation and the Partnership for a Drug-Free America. David has been a criminal defense attorney for over 40 years. He's been fighting for the little guy who ends up in court. And David has been also a published author. He's written over 5 books on the topic of drugs. He has interviewed countless places. I've seen him on CNN, I've seen him on Bloomberg, I've seen him on Fox, I've seen him on Fox Business. He is a primary speaker on the other side of the fence here. And David, I know you were a manager for the state of New Jersey's intoxicated drug program, and you were a research scientist for the New Jersey Department of Health. You've got some really impressive chops in science and policy, and we're really delighted to have you here today. I know you're also a faculty member at Rutgers University and faculty member at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. As you approach the stage, I do have one other question for you as well. And that is, Mr. Evans, now, you've been on the con side for a lot of years now. And here you are at the Pro Conference, and I am so curious. Do you feel comfortable here?
Well, I've been a criminal defense attorney for 40 years, so yes, I'm very comfortable. I'm comfortable being in the presence of criminals. Thanks.
Good one. All right, thank you. Thank you, David. Okay, so let me just get to the rules real quick, and then we're going to go. So here's the rules. Rules are, we're going to have 3 rounds. Round number 1 is each speaker here is going to be able to present their case in 10 minutes. First up will be Mr. David Evans. Second up will be Mr. Ethan Nadelman. After that, that concludes round 1. Then we're going to go to round 2. And round 2 is where we're going to get to ask questions. I'll get to ask questions. They'll get to ask questions of each other. And you will get to ask questions. So start thinking about what question you might want to ask. When we get to that part, I'll ask that you raise your hand. And our CEO, Jay Rakow, will rush over to you with a hot microphone, and you'll be able to ask your question as well. So that's going to be round 2. Then we're going to go to round 3. Round 3 is quite a bit shorter. It's the conclusion round. And in that round, we're first going to hear from Mr. Ethan Nadelman. Then we're going to hear from Mr. David Evans. And that's going to be it. So the whole procedure is going to take us right up to the 3 o'clock, 45-minute mark, and then we're done. So let's make the most of it, folks. And with that, I want to introduce our first speaker on the side arguing against legalization. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. David Evans.
Good afternoon. I have very modest goals here today. I hope that you will believe what I have to say. And if you believe what I have to say, I hope that that will, in some way, at least for some of you, overcome your selfishness and greed, and that you might decide to pursue a different career. I want to establish a few more of my credentials. I'm a recovering addict. I own a nursing home. I am a volunteer EMT. I was president of a rescue squad for several years and spent hundreds of hours a year helping sick and dying people as a volunteer. I say this because I'm opposed to medical marijuana. I'm opposed to marijuana legalization, and people accuse me of being a hard-hearted son of a bitch. So I just want to make it clear to you that I'm not. I've had some terrible things said about me on the internet. My favorite was that somebody was playing up to a stereotype, I guess, of people that are against marijuana, and that's sort of like the Saturday night church lady stereotype, you know, except that I'm a male. And they were talking about me and what I was like in college, and that I must have been a guy in college that wore suspenders and never knocked back a beer and banged a hottie. So I immediately took that to my wife. She got very offended by that, that you guys thought my wife wasn't hot. So I just ask you in future, no more comments about my wife, please. I appreciate it. Now, I think where we're at with marijuana legalization right now is where we were at with tobacco in the 1950s. The public was not aware of the danger of tobacco use just like the public today is not aware of the dangers of marijuana use. Their perception of marijuana is about 30 years old. They think of it as the Woodstock weed. In time, the public perception is going to be replaced by accurate knowledge and the science. And when that happens, society is going to come after you, and you're going to be held responsible for what you're doing now, just like we did with tobacco. If you look at the lawsuits that were against the tobacco industry, the civil RICO cases and everything else like that, if you take the word tobacco out and put marijuana in, it's a perfect match. Lying to people about the addictiveness and damage of your product, hiding the science, false advertising, all this kind of stuff. I remember when I was a kid, there were ads, I think it was for Lucky's cigarettes, saying that 9 out of 10 doctors recommended smoking Lucky's, things like that. You're making similar false claims. And what we're going to do about that, since the government really isn't helping us right now, we've decided to get a group of people who are just as venal and as selfish as you are and greedy to go after you. So we're going to be relating a lot to the trial lawyers. And we're going to let them know what you're doing, particularly with medical marijuana. What you're doing with medical marijuana is grossly negligent. You're recommending a substance that is not proven to be safe and effective by the FDA. You're causing a lot of damage. I'm a cancer survivor. I feel very deeply about this. People may choose to use marijuana rather than get a medicine that might be really effective for them. I have a spinal cord injury. I was in a car crash. I have an atrophied left leg. I understand what nerve pain is all about. I've had to wear braces. To mislead people and to make them think that marijuana is helping them as a medicine for your commercial interests is really grossly negligent and irresponsible. And someday we're going to catch up with you about that. Not now, but we will ultimately. We're organizing all across the country now, organizations like SAM, you have CALM in California. We don't match your resources right now, but we will. If you look at the resources that the anti-tobacco folks have, we're going to have those someday, and we're coming after you. So in hopes that perhaps what I will say will deter some of you, at least from maybe ending your careers a little bit earlier. I spoke to a woman earlier who's working in the industry, who had a teenage daughter who was struggling with this issue. Here I'm promoting marijuana, and I got a teenage kid. And I hope she resolves that ethical issue on behalf of her child. But why am I against marijuana legalization? Well, I'm against marijuana legalization because you are creating a big marijuana industry. When I talk about this, I ask people, I say, well, look, do you think, how many people here in this room think that the big tobacco industry is on the side of your family? Nobody raises their hand. And then I say, well, how many of you think that the drug cartels are on the side of your family, that are looking out for your family's best interests? Nobody raises their hand. And then I say, how many of you think that the big marijuana industry is going to look out for your family's interests? Nobody raises their hand. So you're in that category now. You're in the category of the cartels and big tobacco. And you're going to stay there. And you like that because you want to make money, you want to expand your market. So that's why I'm against it. Right now, we've got maybe 15 to 20 million marijuana users in the United States, maybe half of the country uses alcohol on a regular basis, tobacco less. If you have your way, you're going to have marijuana inching up and maybe surpassing some of those numbers and all the damage that's going to be caused by that. There is no question that legalization, and let's not call it legalization, that's a false thing to say. Okay? And by the way, I want to make a comment about the title of this debate, the great marijuana debate. There's nothing great about what you're doing. Okay? This is not on the level of the Lincoln Douglas debates about slavery. Okay? This is not a great debate. It's too bad that we have to have this debate. But legalization is really commercialization of marijuana. That's what it's about. And when I talk with people about this, they say, well, yeah, I'm in favor of legalization. I mean, yeah, somebody should have a right to smoke a joint at home on Saturday night. Then I say, well, isn't it really more about commercialization, about advertising, promoting, expanding market share, appealing to kids? And I know you're all going to claim, no, gee, we don't want kids to use marijuana. What a load of bullshit that is, okay? Just like the tobacco industry, you're going to market to young people. You're already doing it. In Colorado, we got Sesame Street characters advertising marijuana. We got Santa Claus. We got Shatter under the name of Girl Scout Cookie Shatter. Those are all things that appeal to kids. In Ohio, you created a little cartoon character called Buddy to promote marijuana legalization, just like we had Joe Camel for cigarettes. By the way, I was equally appalled at what the alcohol beverage industry has done in appealing to young people. In the mid-1980s, I chaired an American Bar Association committee, and we took on the alcoholic beverage industry, just like I'm now taking you on. And we were successful in a lot of ways. It's harmful to kids. And if it becomes commercialized, even though it's only sold for people 21 years old, kids are going to get it. In Colorado right now, the leading source of marijuana that kids are getting comes from somebody who bought it legally. I hope you're proud of that. And it's going to get worse. The kids in Colorado now lead the country in marijuana use. I hope you're proud of that. The adults are also increasing. Marijuana expansion and commercialization is going to increase public costs. Looking at alcohol and tobacco as our guide, for every dollar we get in revenue, we pay out $10 or more in social costs. The World Health Organization just came out, I think it was today, with a report that there's a clear link between marijuana use and the onset of mental illness and schizophrenia. You're going to make money on marijuana. I'm going to wind up paying the costs. Everybody else who's not in the industry is going to wind up paying the costs for what you're doing. The black market still functioning very strong in Colorado. The cartels, what a baloney argument that is. Most of the marijuana in the United States is locally produced. I was just listening to somebody bragging about how many acres he's got up in Oregon. It's not going to cut down much on the cartels. The other lie that you consistently put out to people is that there's all these people in prison for small amounts of marijuana. That's another, it's just not true. It just isn't true. I have been a criminal defense attorney for 40 years. I consult all over the country on this issue. People are not going to prison for possession of small amounts of marijuana. In the federal prisons, less than 1%. State prisons, it's less than that. In the federal prisons, the average amount of marijuana somebody had, and they're in for possession and trafficking, not for possession of marijuana. It's 115 pounds of marijuana. That's not personal use of marijuana. I really wish you'd stop telling people that lie. It's absolutely untrue. Kids can, if they get arrested, can get their records expunged. It's not an impediment to getting college scholarships. As long as they go into treatment, they will get it back, and that's a matter of the federal law. So I hope that you take a good look at the other side. I hope you take a good look at what you're doing to children and to healthcare in the country. And if you can work that out within your own mind, well, then there's no sense in me talking to you anyway, because I don't feel you have any conscience at all. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. All right. And now for, thank you, Mr. David Evans. And now our speaker arguing in favor of legalization, Mr. Ethan Nadelman.
Okay. Wow, David.
And you did terrific. And I brought you some water.
It's amazing, actually. I've debated this issue for a very long time, including when the support for legalizing was around 25% of the country, and it's rare to hear those arguments made in that way anymore. I mean, it's almost, I'm thinking about the old debates over communism. And, you ever hear of the John Birch Society? You know, when everybody in America was anti-communist, there was a group that thought there was a communist under every bed and, around every corner, and Russians in the China, So I think we've heard the John Bircher view of the support for marijuana prohibition here. Look, why have I been involved in trying to legalize marijuana? I mean, I think I should start off clearly. It's never been for me or for Drug Policy Alliance, my organization, a pro-marijuana view. Right? We've been very clear at all times that in advocating to end marijuana prohibition and to substitute it with a responsible system of taxation and regulation, that we were representing the views both of people who loved marijuana, people who hated marijuana, and people who didn't give a damn about marijuana. Right? In the same way that the people who supported the repeal of alcohol prohibition included both people who liked to have a drink as well as prominent people like John D. Rockefeller, a teetotaler all his life, who hated alcohol but had come to realize that alcohol prohibition was doing more harms than the alcohol use had been intended to eradicate. So I should start off by saying, and I should say, speaking personally as somebody who has enjoyed marijuana for the last 40 years and been an occasional consumer all that time, and who has many friends who have used marijuana responsibly and occasionally, and a few friends who have had a problem with marijuana, that this is really ultimately not about whether you like marijuana or not. I know that many of you in the industry, some of you like it, some of you don't, some of you don't give a damn, right? That's it. It's not about the like for that. It really is the argument that marijuana, keeping it illegal, it seems so obvious to say. I have to stop for that. I haven't debated this issue of legalization in a couple of years. Most of the debates I've been involved in is how do we legalize? How do we regulate? What are the issues we deal with? And I think it's been a couple of years. I don't know if it was the last time since I debated you, David, years ago in New York, that I've debated this in the United States. I'm used to going like to countries like Latin America or Africa to debate this issue. Like, let's open up new territory on this stuff. But I should say that the argument has been that marijuana prohibition and the war on marijuana and the war on people who use marijuana has been a ghastly, horrific policy in America and around the world for many, many decades, right? 10 million, almost 20 million people have been arrested for marijuana over the last 40 or 50 years. Until recently, even last year, over 600,000 people getting arrested for marijuana, mostly possession in the United States. In many states still, right now, I was just pulling out our fact sheet, this is 1 year old, but just to reel off a few of the numbers on this thing, that even a criminal conviction, a misdemeanor marijuana conviction can lead to a bar on adopting a child in 38 states, a revocation of a professional license in 20 states, denial of federal financial aid for a year or more in 28 states, suspension of one's driver's license for 6 months in 21 states in D.C., a ban on going to public housing for 3 years in 46 states. For non-citizens, it can trigger deportation, with almost no possibility of discretionary relief. In fact, simple marijuana possession was the 4th most common cause of deportation for any crime in 2013, with more than 13,000 people deported for this in 2012, 2013. Those sort of statistics make me sick. And the reason I've been so passionate about ending marijuana prohibition is because of those harms. I've known too much people and know too much of the evidence about how many people have been hurt by that policy. I'm also aware of the extraordinary racial disproportionality and racism that has permeated this war on marijuana and the broader war on drugs for all too long. Ask, why was marijuana criminalized in the first place? Overwhelmingly not about scientific evidence. I mean, you look at the you look at the 1914 debates on the Harrison Act, 1937 Federal Congressional, Marijuana Tax Act, state stuff. I mean, they look like they look like comedy routines in terms of the evidence that was being presented at this stuff. Right? There was not medical evidence being provided. There was no National Academy of Science saying that marijuana prohibition would be a better policy than marijuana legalization and regulation. What it had to do with overwhelmingly was prejudice and stigma and fear directed at Mexican Americans and Mexican migrants in the Southwest and the western states of this country, beginning with the first criminalizations of marijuana in Texas and California a little over 100 years ago. In almost every state, it was xenophobic reactions to Mexicans, Mexican migrants, right, Mexican Americans, and prejudice against them that was resulting in the institution, first at the state level, of these prohibition laws, right? There was no science there. I sometimes gets me actually a little upset when I see that, we have to put the burden of proof on those who want to advocate for reform of drug laws or decriminalization or legalization and prove that these things will accomplish better results than we're doing now. But no burden of proof was ever imposed on those who advocated for the prohibition laws in the first place, whether with marijuana or other drugs as well. No cost-benefit studies, no consideration of what would be the consequences on the health and well-being of people who did, in fact, use these drugs. What would be the consequences when government shifted billions of dollars towards enforcement of futile marijuana and other drug laws instead of spending money on trying to help people. Right? So, I mean, when I say what drove me to do this, to say there's something fundamentally wrong with this policy, not just with marijuana, right? The broader drug war. And we're not advocating here to treat heroin and cocaine and methamphetamine the same as marijuana. We are advocating to roll back the drug war wherever possible and to rely on public health and human rights and sensible policies to deal with the problems of addiction and abuse rather than criminalizing the people and the populations who use these drugs, whether responsibly or otherwise. That's what this is about. That's what this is about. So. If marijuana were anything like tobacco in the way that David is suggesting, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. The notion of equating marijuana with cigarettes and the tobacco industry, when they interview heroin addicts and they say, what's the toughest drug to quit? You know what most heroin addicts say? Cigarettes, right? Cigarettes are responsible for the premature death of roughly, 400,000 Americans a year in this country and tens of millions around the world. Cigarettes, an extraordinarily deadly product, right? Combining a highly dependent-causing drug, nicotine, with a highly destructive form of consumption. How many people are dying from marijuana? Even though we've had, 100 million people use marijuana, not quite the numbers of cigarettes, but significant numbers. You can probably, first of all, you can probably find people who have smoked enough marijuana that you could maybe find some cancer deaths in that mix. There are probably some people who smoked weed and did stupid stuff and maybe used marijuana and alcohol who landed up dying on the roads. How many people have died from a marijuana overdose? Zero. Right? When the DEA's own administrative law judge, Francis Young, held multiple years of hearings back in the 80s about whether or not marijuana should be rescheduled from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2, and what was one of the conclusions in his opinion? That marijuana may well be the least dangerous psychoactive substance commonly used in human history. That was the administrative law judge of the DEA, right? So we're talking about a drug which is not totally safe, and I do believe people can become addicted to marijuana and dependent upon marijuana. I'm not crazy about young people waking and baking and screwing up in school and things like that. None of us want to see that happen. And it's important to me that the industry be committed to trying to minimize and address those problems as much as possible. But marijuana is one of the least dangerous psychoactive substances out there. And the notion of analogizing this substance to tobacco or this industry to the tobacco industry, I think, is fundamentally mistaken. I was surprised. I had forgotten that David still opposed medical marijuana. It's hard to find anybody who will get up there now and say that marijuana actually has no medical beneficial effects. With the hundreds, if not thousands, of studies around the world, from Israel throughout Europe and the United States, with the evidence that's emerged in terms of dealing with the nausea of chemotherapy, with appetite enhancement, the interesting research in terms of cancer suppression and things like that, all of the things emerging with neurological substances. You can go on the website, not just of Drug Policy Alliance and Americans for Safe Access and Normal MPP, but for that matter, the National Institute of Health, and look at the extensive research in this area. So, the fact that legalization of marijuana, first for medical purposes and now more broadly, will enable this substance to be used by people who need it for those purposes, the possibility that people will begin to use this substance and substitute it for more dangerous substances, whether they're opioids or pharmaceutical substances or alcohol, I think holds enormous promise. So quite frankly, marijuana, I want you guys in the industry to be responsible, but let's understand that even if you screw it up badly, this substance is just simply not that dangerous where it's going to cause a lot of harm in the society. Please do it right, but the notion that we should keep it illegal and continue to impose those penalties on millions of Americans that we've seen over the last 10 to 20, 30, 40 years, I think would be a ghastly mistake. Thanks.
What my question is for you is, are the issues that are in front of the cannabis industry, such as drug driving, such as addiction, such as youth use, such as standardization of dosages, such as equal access, such as diversity issues, are those kinds of issues you think endemic to the industry now? Is the industry now in the boat that the tobacco industry was, say, in the 1950s, where there's some hubris to it, where it's just, let's go after the money? Or do you think the industry really has to look itself in the face and say, what are we doing? Let's sort this stuff out before we proceed.
Well, I mean, I think the analogy, tobacco industry in the 50s, by that time it was a dominant force selling a highly addictive product with massive resources and massive political power. I'll tell you something. I did an event with Governor Hickenlooper in Colorado last summer, and he was asked by the interviewer a few questions by Tina Brown. And one of the questions was, what was the most surprising thing that he'd found since legalization in Colorado? And his response was how responsible the industry has been there. And that was a good thing to hear, because there's always irresponsible players. There's always people who just want to make a lot of money quick and get out, who don't mind if they burn everybody else, screw things up. You know, and that's the thing where the industry is going to have to find ways to police itself, and also where government regulatory bodies are going to need to step in as well. But I think beyond that, look, all of these issues are things, this is a nascent industry. It's 4 states down and 46 to go, 1 country down and 199 to go. There's a long way to go with all this stuff. Some of these issues, like how you test for driving under the influence and being impaired by cannabis in a way that could hurt people on the roads, we don't really have fully the science on that stuff now. The question about how you create greater diversity in this industry so that people coming from the communities which were most harmed by the war on drugs can actually have an opportunity in this industry, I think is hugely important. I'm very proud of the fact that the initiative that's going to be on the ballot in California, which DPA played a major role in drafting, is going to have elements of sentencing reform and of directing resources from the tax revenue to disadvantaged communities in a way that's going to set a major precedent for this country. I think the issues around labeling and things like that, these are all things that need to be worked out. And when people start to say, well, let's keep this illegal, that illegal, edibles illegal, my say is like, the deterrent effect of keeping things illegal. There's some truth that when you keep something illegal, you'll deter and discourage some people. But the downsides of criminalization are so enormous. And meanwhile, the opportunities to engage in effective regulation to do this in the right way, I think present an opportunity to deal with marijuana in a mature way in our society.
I understand. Thank you for that response. I have one more question for each of you, and then we're going to let you guys ask questions of each other and open up to the audience. Another question for you, Mr. Evans, and this is where the Economist magazine, they had written an article where they were advising their readers and advising people who are in the con camp. They called it to stop what they called flagging the dead horse of prohibition. And they said that the people on the con side are missing an opportunity to work in partnership with the pro side and try to build in some of the elements of safety and work with them for things like how to reduce youth addiction, how to make the rules for driving while drug tighter, improving testing and doing those things, and that if the camps are too far apart, then they can't work together and address these concerns that are very important to you that I know. So my question is, what are your thoughts about working at odds with the industry versus working with the industry?
You know, I talked to some friends of mine that were involved in bringing the tobacco industry under control and taking action against them. And what they told me is, don't work with the industry. And I'm not going to work with you. I'm going to oppose you. And I'm going to leave it up to the trial lawyers to take care of educating you on what you need to do. I would certainly welcome you if you want to be more responsible, and you can figure out ways to do that. But you know, right now your products are winding up in the hands of kids. According to what's going on in Colorado right now, you talk about disparity. The pot stores are going into lower income and minority neighborhoods. How does that help low income and minority neighborhoods to increase the use of an intoxicant in their neighborhood? So this is a myth that you're putting out that this is somehow going to be helping the disparity issue. So I'm not going to help you. You put forth proposals, put them out in front of the public, and I'll leave it up to you and the trial lawyers to work that out between the two of you.
All right, well, thank you for that response. And then my last question directed towards you, Ethan, and that is a friend of yours, a friend of Procon, Dr. Mark Kleiman. He had a quote in an interview with the Washington Post. He said, the free market is an excellent system for maximizing consumption. And he said, that's why I don't want it to apply to marijuana. And Dr. Kleiman talks about these state-run marijuana distribution centers and really controlling and regulating it, similar to alcohol in some states. And my question for you is, what do you think about these highly regulated approaches like the one that Dr. Kleiman is talking about?
Well, I actually think we need a diversity of approaches. You know, when we repealed alcohol prohibition in this country in 1933, we didn't go to a national system of alcohol control. We had 50 different states. Mississippi stayed dry until I think the late 50s, early 60s. You had state-run liquor monopolies over hard liquor in about 18 or 19 states. You had states like California where you ultimately are selling booze 24/7 in supermarkets and other places where it's more, you know, different taxation rates. And then you have counties. You have dry counties, wet counties, all this stuff. I think that diversity of approaches is a good thing. It reflects democracy. It reflects notions of local control. It also gives us an opportunity to experiment with what, in fact, will work best. I'm curious to see, look, Uruguay's got a very highly regulated system that would never work here, but with a low tax, right? We're aiming for a medium tax to kind of low enough to get rid of the black market or reduce the black market, high enough to discourage really problematic consumption. But I want to see the multiplicity of models. I'd even like to see in the United States things like we're seeing in Spain, like with the cannabis clubs and cooperatives and things like that as well.
I see. Well, thank you for that response.
Sure.
So now we have a few minutes to, what time is it, by the way? 3:05, thank you. I have a few minutes for the debaters to ask questions of each other, and so I will start with Mr. Evans. If you have a question that you want to direct to Mr. Nadelman.
Yeah, you wanted to talk about responsibility. Let's just look at medical marijuana in California. Based on reports from 60 Minutes and other news organizations, you can get medical marijuana for anything, dry skin, if you're upset in high school. What would you recommend to make the medical marijuana industry in California and elsewhere more responsible? Would you, for example, only support FDA quality, scientific, randomized clinical trials before anything would be used as a medicine?
No. I mean, California, we didn't draft the law. Dennis Perot and others drafted that law, but I played a major role in turning the professional campaign and winning that thing in '96. And it definitely is the most wide open of all the laws. In the subsequent initiatives where we were doing the drafting, we set up more medical review boards, limited medical conditions, things like this. But what I would say, David, is at this point, California finally, after almost 20 years of not having a statewide regulatory system, finally passed pretty decent regulation to regulate this area. In the legalization initiative that's going to be on the ballot in November, mostly it was obliged to follow, to some good extent, what was in that medical marijuana regulatory system. There are a few provisions in there that improve upon the legislation to provide greater privacy protections, for example, for patients, so that's not an issue. But I think we're now going to move into a system where people, adults who want to get marijuana to use it for whatever the purpose, medical, quasi-medical, or recreational, will just do so legally. Those people who really have a medical problem will get their doctor's prescription. The requirements will probably get tougher. They will have the benefit of not having to pay taxes when they get their marijuana. But I think it's basically a move into that system, and I think that's really the way it should be.
You know, you really didn't answer my question. I asked about FDA quality, randomized clinical trial studies to see whether or not something was safe and effective as a medicine. What's your position on that?
I think
should you recommend something as a medicine without going through that?
I think that would be a very good thing for the FDA to approve controlled, randomized, double-blind studies on the medical efficacy of marijuana, whole marijuana, CBD, THC, the constituent products. I think that would be a good thing.
You're still dodging my question.
That DEA and others have stood in the way of those sorts of studies for so long. I think it's a shame the National Institute of Drug Abuse for so long blocked those efforts. So one reason we never had those studies, the whole notion that we have to wait for FDA approval, while meanwhile the federal government's blocking those sorts of studies from happening, I think that was part of the farce of all the marijuana prohibition.
Well, that's also
but that said, David, what I would say is I don't regard that as a necessary precondition to making marijuana available medically or otherwise. I think those studies are helpful. It should not be a precondition.
Just wanted to get you on the record about
you
that.
got me on the record.
Okay.
Thank you. And Ethan, do you have any question that you would like to direct to Mr. Evans?
Yeah, I mean, David, the thing that's stunning about your presentation is that what's always missing when you and I have talked is virtually any regard for the people who have been harmed by marijuana prohibition. I just don't hear it. millions and millions of people arrested, criminal records. You have people, especially poor people, being deprived of their children, people being deported from this country. You just seem to think that's just desserts. Is that right?
Well, I've devoted the last 40 years to helping people charged with crimes. I was a public defender in Newark.
But you're not up here doing that, David. You're up here advocating for a continuation
Would you
of
let me
marijuana
finish
prohibition.
answering the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I have devoted my career to representing the underdog. I do plaintiff's employment law in my litigation practice. I'm very sympathetic to people with criminal records. And I believe I'm also very sympathetic to people who are addicts, mothers who've lost children because of marijuana, drug driving victims. I'm sympathetic to all those people also. And they are innocent. They haven't done anything wrong. And yet they are victimized by people who use marijuana. So I believe that there should be a sanction.
And by people who enforce marijuana laws. And by people who advocate for marijuana prohibition laws.
I was courteous to you, and I appreciate courtesy from you.
Go ahead.
Okay. So we have to balance everything out. There's a lot of victims, a lot of health care costs, a lot of damage to society, children going into schizophrenia. So I believe there has to be a sanction, but as I said earlier, I'm not in favor of giving people a criminal conviction record for possession of small amounts of marijuana. I'd like to see them directed into an evaluation, especially kids, to see if they've got a problem. If they get through the evaluation okay, charge gets dropped. That's what I've supported. In fact, I've written a model law to that effect to be able to do that. So you and I reach an agreement on that. I don't think people should get a criminal record, conviction record for small amounts of marijuana. But they should be sanctioned. They should get treatment for the protection of everybody else and themselves. I'm an addict myself. Okay, I started smoking pot when I was 16 years old. I know what it's like to be in the throes of an addiction. I know what it's like to go through withdrawal. I've done it, and I don't want anybody else to have to go through that.
Well, thank you for your responses, gentlemen. So you'll get a chance to address more questions and to be able to speak to one another, but really at this point, I want to hear from you folks. So Jay has the microphone. Where are you, Jay? Okay, so Jay, please take the mic where you think it needs to go. He'll bring a tote bag for ProCon to you as a gift for participating. And please make these questions more than comments. That would be appreciated.
Okay, well, I'd like to start off by thanking both of you by giving us your opinions and some facts. I just want to say, first of all, that we live in America, the greatest country in the world. And so when you have the opportunity to sit up here and debate issues versus be dictated issues, then that brings me great joy. Now, I was never a marijuana user, and I hung with a lot of people that chose to use marijuana. And I don't know any of my friends that chose to use marijuana that became more violent than I did on alcohol. And I'm not an alcoholic, but give me a couple drinks and I might say things or, you know, get a little aggressive. So I want to say that what we need to do is not be...
Is there a question in there? I'm
yes,
sorry. Okay.
yes. My question to both of you is how can we work together to develop a process of systems that understand human behaviors and why we use drugs and how we best can legalize those drugs that will benefit the cost and effect upon our society versus just arguing and quibbling about things that demise our society.
And who would you like to answer that question first? Mr. Nadelman. Okay.
Okay. No, I mean, it's a very good question. Look, the whole thrust, not just of marijuana reform, but of the broader drug policy reform movement, is to reduce the role of criminalization, the criminal justice system in drug control as much as possible, but stopping short at that point at which going any further would endanger public health or public safety. And what that means is that not just with, well, look, with marijuana is the great example out there right now, right? Can we figure out how to regulate this in a responsible way, right? The odds are, as we legalize more broadly, we're going to see a growing number of people using. I don't think it's going to be young people, right? Because I think young people already had such incredible access while it was illegal that they're not going to be as affected. I think it's going to be older people, right? And people oftentimes substituting for other drugs. But I think we got to come up and have this sort of, look, what happened in California, the planning for this initiative with Gavin Newsom's Blue Ribbon Commission that brought in the medical association, the addiction docs, law enforcement, whole range of other players, that was a good model for what needs to happen. What's happening in states like Colorado with the implementation where you're bringing in stakeholders from all sides, that's a model what needs to happen. Now the question becomes, can we apply that to other drugs as well? When we're looking at the problem with overdose fatalities from heroin and pharmaceutical opioids and more people dying this year from an overdose than an auto accident, Are there better ways to deal with this stuff? Because these drugs are legal, quasi-legal, illegal. We got to come up with a better way, and we know that the law enforcement approach is not working. With the new psychoactive substances, you know, the K2, the spice, all these things, we got to come up with another approach to see how we can deal with this most effectively. And I think that's going to involve the thoughtful help people, welfare people, people dealing with kids, people dealing with law enforcement regulation, coming together to figure it out in a mature and responsible way.
Thank you. Mr. Evans, do you have a response you'd like to make to that?
Yeah, I worked for the Division of Addiction Services in New Jersey for 15 years, setting up addiction treatment programs. I do that work now. I represent several addiction treatment programs. So I'm very sensitive to trying to get people into help. I myself benefited from that. I went through treatment in 1974. So there are a lot of ways that we can do this. Certainly, if we can get people before they run afoul of the criminal justice system. But understand that most of the time when people get caught by the criminal justice system, it's not simply just for possession. Typically, marijuana arrests will come in a context of a DUI, and they see a joint or a roach or something, and the kid gets arrested for that also. Rarely, so I've seen in my practice, a kid is arrested for walking down the street smoking a joint. It's usually in connection with something else. They may plea bargain down to the marijuana charge. So the criminal justice system can be used as a means of referring people into treatment. This is what I believe in. This is what I would like to see happen. I don't want people to get criminal records, but it is a method for getting people in. And one thing that I really like is in Minnesota, they have a civil commitment law for addicts and alcoholics, that a family member can come in, go before, I think it's a board, and get their family member committed. There's a lot of families that would like to be able to do that before somebody gets afoul of the criminal justice system. I ran the drunk driving program in New Jersey for 6 years. I had the lowest recidivism rate of any drunk driving program in the country. How did I do that? Everybody that came in got a 2-day evaluation to see if they had a problem with alcohol. If they had a problem with alcohol, they were given 16 weeks minimum treatment, sliding scale. The program was self-supporting from the drunk drivers, no taxpayers' money into it. I made a profit for the state of every year between $100,000 and $300,000. And I put 15,000 people a year into treatment. We did a 5-year study to see if they repeated the offenses. We had the lowest rate in the United States. So that's what I'm in favor of. I want people to get help. If we could intervene before kids get involved in the criminal justice system, that would be great. But a lot of times it's the criminal justice system that motivates somebody to go into treatment. Very few addicts, including myself, ever wake up one morning and say, gee, you know, I looked at the Drug Policy Alliance website, and treatment seems like a good option. I'm going to go into treatment. Virtually everybody is forced one way or the other. And treatment works just as well if you're forced, if not. That's the goal of the treatment.
Thank you.
So I think we have some agreement there. Yeah. It's just how do we get there?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Evans. I believe there's some more questions. Jay, go ahead.
Hi, my question is for David. First of all, before I became my life as a capitalist criminal, I was a teacher for a decade in Colorado, and I have a master's degree, actually 2 of them, but one of them is in biology with a concentration in genetics. So there was just so much, I studied the endocannabinoid system for my master's thesis, and you had so many scientific inaccuracies in your opening statement, I can't even go there. So, however, my question would be, how do you feel about the legalization of alcohol? And a follow-up question to that is, how do you feel about the legalization of fast food and trans fat-laden junk food? Because in my opinion and my research, those things do far greater damage to society than marijuana.
Well, that question always comes up in these debates, you know, alcohol and tobacco are legal and so on and so forth. So I think that the way the law would look at this, when the legal system does something, it doesn't have to be fair. It just has to be somewhat reasonable. And by the way, everything that I said, I can back up with a study or a citation to somebody else. None of this data comes from me. All the stuff that I told you about Colorado comes from Colorado sources, the Colorado Department of Health, the Denver Police Department, so on and so forth. So, as I told you back in the 80s, I took on the alcoholic beverages industry, just like I'm taking on your industry. Okay. They are and still are engaged in a lot of abuses. But right now, we have some control over marijuana because we've got a limited number of people that are using it. If you have your way, the number of people using marijuana is going to go from 20 million up to 30, 40, 50, or 60 million people or more. Okay? And that's happened in Colorado. Colorado is now leading the country in juvenile marijuana use. Are you proud of that? Is that a reform? Well, I'm basing this on the federal household study, which has been around for years and years. Look, I'm not going to, look, I don't want to get into an argument about disorders. We're going to disagree on that. I'm just telling you that everything that I said, excuse me, sir.
We're going to leave
sir,
questions for those with the microphone.
Okay,
I'm
if you
sorry.
have a
Yeah.
question, that's fine.
Yeah.
Everything that I've said, I can point to an objective governmental body that has made this study, okay? So that's it. It doesn't make what you say true either. And, you know, if you want to believe me, fine. If you don't, that's fine. You look it up yourself. I'm not going to get into an argument about studies. It'll go on forever. Okay.
Appreciate that. So,
but it is, if you have any data that drug use, marijuana use among young people in Colorado has gone down since legalization, I'd sure like to see that. What?
How do you personally feel about the legalization of alcohol and trans fat junk? What should be done about this?
I think there should be education about it, and I think that I don't feel that I have to be, who am I being unfair to by going after marijuana? Okay, I know, but who am I being unfair to? Who am I being unfair to? I have chosen to focus on marijuana, okay?
wait a minute, sir.
I think the marijuana should be controlled. It should remain illegal because it'll keep down and it shouldn't be commercialized. When you legalize it, you commercialize it. That's what I'm against, okay? I haven't really looked at the trans fats issue. I don't really have an opinion on that, okay?
We'll leave it at
But
that
I don't think
then.
alcohol should be commercialized for kids either, and that's what I told the alcohol beverage industry.
Yeah.
And your industry is doing that in Colorado right now.
To make
So
sure-
if you want to meet me halfway, you want to be responsible, go after your industry and stop advertising to kids. Well then,
Okay,
good
we've
for
got-
you.
Let's
Then we
move
agree
on.
on that.
There's a lot of folks here who want to ask questions. I want to make sure more people get a chance. So why don't you go ahead, Jay?
Dr. Evans, I'm personally offended. To call me grossly negligent and irresponsible, to accuse me of not having any conscience at all, I believe just exposes your own self-righteous and bigoted opinion.
Now, is there a question in there? I'm sorry.
I think you're a smart man and you're educated, so I surmise that your anti-marijuana conclusions are attitudinal rather than rational. I know you're a victim of propaganda.
I'm sorry. There's a lot of people who want to ask questions.
I
Can you
want to
please
just
ask a
ask,
question?
can you give
Okay.
me the name of the 3 clinical journals or the 3 most recent books about cannabis that you've read?
The most recent journal that I just read, a journal article, was in the Journal of the American Medical Association, published about a week and a half ago, saying that marijuana leads to the onset of several substance abuse disorders. The most recent thing that I just read was the World Health Organization report. I just read it before I walked in here, on recreational use of marijuana, saying that there is clear evidence that it is responsible for the onset of schizophrenia, damage to young people, educational problems. I just read that a couple hours ago. That's the World Health Organization. That's not some right-wing John Birch Society organization.
My question,
The World Health
you're
Organization.
not answering my question. I
I
wanted
just
to
did.
know
You
the
asked me
names
what-
of the journals.
I just
Name
did.
3 scientific cannabis journals that you read regularly. I don't want you referring us to articles.
Well, that wasn't your question. You asked me before about journals that I read, and I gave you the answer. I don't. I read your websites. I get information from the websites about cannabis and things that your industry is up to. When I do legislative work and put together information, I look at a variety of sources. I've looked at Procon. I look at everything.
Yeah. Okay. So, Jay, I believe you have another question over there, and if there's any for Ethan over here, go for it. Who's up next? And please, again, we're looking for questions, not comments.
I have a question. You're a big shot in the state of New Jersey. In the state of New Jersey, the #1 drug that's killing kids are prescribed by doctors. They're opiates, and they lead to heroin addiction, which further kills kids and young adults and causes the greatest episode of addiction this country's ever seen. How do you feel that, or I guess my question is, why aren't you taking the fight to the doctor